Thanks, Paul, for inviting me. Thanks, Brian, for helping make it possible to be here. And thanks to all the previous speakers for such rich and information-dense presentations. As Christian was mentioning, mine is going to be taking a step back to something a little bit more, let's say, conceptual, cultural, and artistic. And maybe that will help with ideas, frameworks for synthesizing some of all of the kind of really rich content that we just shared and how we talk about thermal energy storage systems with non-experts. So, like Andrew, sorry, is that better? Oh, thank you. I'm shorter, yeah, it turns out. Yeah, so like Andrew said before me, I am not a subject matter expert in this area. I'm a process architect. My training is in conventional architecture, and I'm specialized in facilities planning for industrial projects. At the building scale, a lot of what that looks like is kind of bridging or synthesizing between the technical and humanist issues in things like equipment layouts, where the tank goes, and then do the humans have access to it to clean it or whatever. And at larger regional and territorial scales around industrial planning, it looks like topics exactly like this, of kind of how do we bridge between these very technical systems and the way that we think about them, talk about them, make meaning, and stitch them into the worlds in which we live. So this, this talk is on what I'm calling orienting narratives. We have plenty of established orienting narratives for how to talk about and present geothermal storage systems. That slide on the left has probably a lot of the kind of typical benefits that you're used to seeing people talk about when you're presenting or making the case for thermal energy storage systems to a non-specialist audience. They're great. There's nothing wrong with them. They seem pretty accurate, but Paul invited this talk because he was unsatisfied with them. And we want to dig deeper and really believing in these types of projects, thinking we can increase the rate of adoption of thermal energy storage systems, and that maybe having some kind of more profound or exhilarating orienting narratives that really help tell this story in a more inspiring way could potentially be helpful. So in the same spirit that we're testing geothermal storage as a name for all of these many, as you said, sort of alphabet of acronyms, this talk is also going to sort of workshop some experimental orienting narratives. These are not proposals. This is just an experiment to see what we can come up with and whether you like any of them. So I'm going to be pulling mostly from what I'm calling a cultural history of geothermal storage. So like my colleague Young mentioned, these are not new technologies. They go back thousands of years. And I think looking at a lot of these simpler historical systems makes it easier for us to pull out first principles and kind of simple essences of these systems that maybe give us fodder for orienting narratives that can reach and maybe even move non-specialist audiences. That's the hypothesis anyway. You might hate it, we'll find out. What is an orienting narrative? I hope it's pretty self-explanatory, but I think one of the things that's maybe important to think about are sort of what are our criteria for what will constitute a good one. You guys, I've put 3 up on the slides here that I think are pretty helpful. You might have other other criteria as well for what makes a good orienting narrative that, again, would love to hear your thoughts and discuss. Clear is obvious, it's got to be clear. Storage is key, super clear, love it, nailed it, already great. Ennobling, people like aspirational. I think, I was trying to think about what are sort of other slogans or orienting narratives to help give you guys that other industries have come up with. I think energy transition is one that has this kind of aspirationally, we have this idea that there's a kind of an epical shift happening. A lot of researchers will say there's no such thing as energy transition. We still use every form of energy we've ever developed. We've just been adding new ones as we increase our energy, but it makes sense as an orienting narrative, right? And it gives us a sense of a trajectory and a direction. And I think navigating tension is also another really interesting and important one. If you want a narrative that will last, you have to include sort of some of your challenges and what you're up against. So for example, like better living through chemistry is one that I think is pretty flat. It's aspirational and it's clear, but it doesn't take seriously what are the downsides of embracing these technologies, versus maybe reduce, reuse, recycle, I think is a kind of fun one that, it holds some of the tension in the adoption of these principles within it, that this is plural, complex, when should we reuse, when should we reduce, whatever. So I think something that can navigate or hold tension is also a good criteria to think about. So these are the 6 that we're going to explore today. I'll walk you through case studies that I think illustrate each of them. So we'll skip this slide just to start getting into it. So the very first and maybe deepest and most important one is this idea that the Earth is first and foremost already a thermal storage system. Or I actually called it a thermal storage body because the planet is not a system, the environment is not a system. A system is multiple kind of interlocking components that are organized around achieving an objective. And frankly, the Earth has no objective, it merely exists. And that, in our context, is actually kind of lovely because it's just out there occurring. And when we have targeted objectives, we don't actually have to do so much. You can just kind of tap into all of that merely already occurring that is out there. I think, probably everyone in this room is very familiar with soil, go 10 meters down. It's stable all year round. It's already averaging all 4 seasons. Obviously, permafrost, glaciers, sphagnum moss does an incredible job at decoupling between atmospheric and subsurface temperatures. Oceans, also we'll get into that a little bit in thinking about cooling, but probably most of you know that something like 90% of the excess surface heat that hits the Earth ends up in our oceans. And they do a great job already. So kind of like we say here, maybe we're really just trying to learn how to access this larger storage body and enjoy doing less. We were chatting a little bit before with Christian. It's kind of a lot of trouble to dig lithium out, build chemical energy storage systems, then have to house them and so on and so forth. There's maybe something kind of relaxing in this framework of just enjoying doing less. I think probably you're very familiar, obviously, maybe it already came up. Root cellars are probably one of the oldest examples of using this in a cooling context. And in a heating context, I was actually excited to share a Korean example. It's somewhat in honor of our colleague and also just because it's a really cool one. Does anybody here know about ondol systems? Maybe, yes? Cool, yeah, so they have like a 2,000-year history, something like that. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that like hippocausts and a lot of other systems, obviously, that force heat underneath a building floor to then radiate up through the floor. Ondols just, make use of a lot of thermal mass, both below just being in direct contact with the ground, but also they use a lot of granite stones in the floor system as well to be able to hold as much thermal mass in the floor as possible when you're heating. And I really wanted to share this example because there's an incredible, it's called the Chilbusa Temple that was built in 560 AD, and it is rumored to have an ondol system that can stay warm off of one charge for 100 days. And this actually ties in with the meditation culture in this temple because the practice is that you charge once and then the monks would meditate for the entire 100-day period before the next charge. And it's interesting also, I read that some folks theorize, some historians theorize that this actually was part of creating the sort of floor-centric culture in Korea, that before the Joseon period, there were a lot more evidence of chairs and people sitting on furniture. And then as the ondol was adopted across more social classes, it became an increasingly floor-centric culture because it was just nice to sit on the floor. This is another really classic one. Probably, do folks here know the Yakchal system also? The Persian ice houses. So these are two examples of what I'm going to call catching waves, or following seasons between winter and summer heat low leveling, and day and night. So in the day-night cycle, the Yakchal is a really beautiful historical example of making ice in the desert at night. They would put a really, really thin tray of water. In the desert, the air is really thin and very dry at night, so you can get radiative cooling like directly out to space. And actually, if the water is thin enough, you'll end up with ice in the morning. There's a pit storage inside of this conical earthen structure, and you can keep ice in the daytime, and it was obviously an incredible luxury, but this system obviously allows you to take advantage of diurnal cycling, and then those were often paired with a different piece of infrastructure that actually doesn't really have to do with waves, but I just really wanted to show it because it's another cool piece of Iranian thermal energy storage. And these are the Kantrowitz, which were an underground aquifer system. Not an underground, but an aqueduct system, and they were dug way down deep into the earth, both to prevent evaporation, as well as to use the earth as a thermal energy buffer, so that the water would arrive cool and be able to be used for irrigation, but also for building cooling systems when tied in with wind towers. And something like you could drop about 10 degrees in a building using water that was delivered by one of these systems. And they're very, very cool. I think one of the things that I also wanted to mention about the Kanat that's interesting is that, in a way, when we look at these historical systems that are very simple, it also starts to blur a bit between what is distribution infrastructure and what is thermal storage infrastructure. Because obviously they were, digging an aqueduct in order to also move the water from point A to point B, but by sheltering it underground, the plumbing mechanism is also itself an energy storage system, helping to keep the water cool until it's arriving at its final destination. So if this is a kind of example of a diurnal cycle, this is a very classic. Ice is a very classic example of kind of how we can think about thermal energy storage systems that allow us to capture seasonal cycling. So before we had refrigeration, obviously we used ice in the summer, and most of it was harvested in the winter. The technology actually of the international ice trade was started in Boston. That was where the first guy had the idea to actually put ice on ships, pack it in sawdust, and send it to the Caribbean. But it was really Norway that picked up the technology and really scaled with it. And it was really like the heyday was at the end of the 19th century. Mechanical refrigeration got popular enough by like the 1920s, 1930s that the industry just completely tanked. But at its peak, there was something like, I think the US was shipping, what were my numbers? Yeah, like 200 million kilos of ice a year, and Norway was shipping something like 900 million kilograms of ice a year, like to places as far as India. So and obviously, like, it's very cool also that these snow cooling systems are things that are also being used in modern thermal energy storage systems. So this is a diagram that comes from Oslo Airport's snow cooling storage system. And there's a couple of other ones, like there's a hospital I saw in Sweden that has a snow storage system, and maybe folks know of other examples of that. So these are just, again, really nice, simple examples of seasonal load leveling. I think this one is another really key one. So if sort of following cycles, joining forces, moving from individual solutions of individual actors to communal solutions of many people all cooperating and collaborating together. My personal favorite example of this is the Emperor Penguin Huddle. This is where I'd love to stop and show the video if it's okay.
Outside take the brunt of the storm. Those on the inside take tiny steps that move the huddle in waves.
Cool. And forgive me because these are not storage systems, but I think district heating is obviously, to an American, just a very beautiful way to talk about and think about also moving from individual to more collective and more communally planned. ways of thinking about thermal energy. And in honor of being in the North American West, it's very exciting to mention that Boise, Idaho built a geothermal district heating system actually in 1890. Reykjavik didn't start until 1930, so that's actually pretty cool. And this is also important in the context of knowing that places like Europe and China that have a much more communal mindset around thermal energy, where there's 200,000 or something like that kilometers of district heating in both of those contexts. The US has something like 5,000 to 8,000 kilometers total of district heating piping in the entire country. So go Boise, very cool, way out there. And I think the other example that I wanted to mention in the context of district heating, they have storage systems, but I think are folks familiar with the Open District Heating project in Stockholm? I think this is also very relevant to similarly some of the topics that just came up of, they've had a district heating system there since the 1950s, but in 2014 introduced the infrastructure physically and also politically to be able to have what they now call their open district heating system. So it's not just a unidirectional utility delivering district heat to users, but anybody who has surplus heat can easily sell into the district heating grid. So they now have relationships with something like 20 or so suppliers, many of which are data centers, and that's a really cool model for this more communal approach. This is this orienting narrative of as Earth gets hotter, geothermal storage can help us stay cool. Obviously, in Europe, the heat budget is a big reason to think about geothermal systems and thermal storage in general, but in many other places, Europe included, also cooling demand is only going to increase as the planet gets hotter, and thermal energy storage systems are a really great way to get access without having to deal with electricity directly to cooling. Beavers do this, which is awesome. It turns out that the force that is created by the water hitting against a beaver dam impels the streams generally down into the stream bed, where, again, back to the Earth being a thermal energy storage system is already, whatever it is, typically like 10 or 12 degrees Celsius. The water will then upwell later downstream and is a studied microclimate that supports like more sort of vulnerable like baby trout and salmon oftentimes will gravitate towards these cooler microclimates that are created by beaver dams due to this, like impelling water down into the earth and then having it upwell after. So they are, as we always say, beavers are little engineers, and they even make aquifer thermal energy storage systems, which is very cool. These projects also are super neat. Toronto has this massive, we discussed that we can include deep source, lake source, and ocean source cooling in the conversation of underground thermal energy storage because it's below the surface, if that's all right. And obviously it's really phenomenal that, say projects like this are so technologically simple that you can just pull the cool water directly from the bottom of the lake. Toronto's serving from their lake source cooling system to about 100 buildings downtown right now. Cornell University in the United States has also developed a lake source cooling system, and I've seen that Hong Kong and Bahrain also have ocean source cooling, and this is probably a really great application as, one of the things that Paul and I were talking about in this context is obviously air conditioners, besides that they consume electricity, also literally contribute to the heat island effect. So supporting municipalities and states in planning for how to provide cooling through thermal energy storage is probably going to only be more in demand in the future. Staying cool. Maybe that's a helpful orienting narrative to get people excited about this. This one, kind of similar, just reaching for a low-hanging fruit in that there's a lot of conversation around full electrification, but obviously a lot of the folks in this room, we know that planning for thermal energy storage is, or just planning for thermal energy in general also is really important. I really like this example. This is The Dover Sun House was built by 3 women, a female client, a female architect, and a female engineer in 1948. And even though the image looks like it's some sort of weird PV panel system, actually it was just kind of like a heat duct that went down into the basement where they had, I think it was, what was the name of it? Graupsen salt? I forget the name of the exact salt, but it was a phase change salt battery in the basement that would charge and then re-release heat. And I wanted to get one phase change material into this presentation, but I just like that it kind of skips straight to thermal energy storage in a solar house. PV panels, they're cool, but you don't always need one. And yeah, I think we'll just end with this last contender narrative. Obviously, a lot of the times you can't see thermal energy storage systems once they're built, because they're underground. But if good design is obvious, great design is invisible. Just take it for granted. It's there. It works so well that you don't even see it. And maybe this is also connected with it feeling safe, secure, and sovereign for folks, that we don't see them, they're buried, they're out of the way. Like, for example, the Vasaras cave thermal storage system, you're not even allowed to know the location of it. It is both underground and highly locked away. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe these are nice ways to sell these projects. But yeah, anyway, do you like any of these narratives? Do any of them compel you? I hope that the different examples we just showed sort of illustrate, using these obviously very simple historical cases, a way to sort of think about, understand, and then share with others each of these 6 contender narratives. You guys would all do a much better job than me of trying to figure out how to apply any of these to talking about the contemporary projects that you're working on, or telling me that they're all terrible and not useful for communicating about your work. But I hope at least this is maybe something that's interesting to discuss and bounce ideas around on. And yeah, I hope that in general that topics like this will be helpful in growing adoption of geothermal storage systems. So, thanks very much.